Good morning. Jim Kelly here from Renaissance Christian Church in Vancouver, British Columbia. Welcome to our Sunday service. For the summer, we are only having services a couple of times a month, and on alternate Sundays I will be doing a video message. So I hope you enjoy this message, and if you're in Vancouver next Sunday, I hope you'll join us at Renaissance Church. Today's message is both a message and a testimony. I'm going to talk today about the subject of, does Jesus care? Well, in Mark chapter 4, we read about a terrible storm, and the disciples were really afraid. So they asked a question. Remember, they were out on a boat, storm came up, and they wondered whether Jesus actually cared about what was going on with them. They wondered if he was apathetic to their desperate situation. Actually, they were accusing him of indifference. They were in a panic. They were afraid they were going to drown. They thought this was going to be their final storm. And while they're panicking, Jesus is sleeping. He wasn't doing anything. Well, who could sleep through a storm like that? His inactivity makes them wonder whether he really does care what's happening to them. Don't you care if we drown? Some of us have been where the disciples were. We're facing storms in our lives, and we don't see any way out. Winds are blowing, waves are beating, and we feel lost. We're filled with fear, and we have been hoping that Jesus is going to step in and bring a dramatic change to our circumstances, but instead, he doesn't seem to be doing anything. So was Jesus indifferent? Does he actually care about our lives? The disciples woke Jesus up, and they dared to ask a threatening question upon which hangs much of our faith in Jesus. Do you care if we perish? Our question is like the disciples. God, don't you care? Not only is this a central question, it's an eternal question. Well, the answer is Jesus does care. He cares a lot. Jesus arises and calms the raging storm. He cares and he acts. It's dark. All hope seems lost. And Jesus arises, speaks to the wind and the waves, and they become calm. Yes, Jesus cares. He cares a great deal. 1 Corinthians 2:9 tells us that it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. All things are possible to them that believe. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. Faith lifts our vision, calls the impossible possible, and says it is achievable. Hope may seem absent. The outlook is bleak, but believe God. With Jesus in your life, there should be a new passion for life, for pursuing your dreams when he is in control. It's all about being made new on the inside. Let this mind be in you which is in Christ Jesus. We will feel his passion in the way we worship, the way we love, the way we work, the way we play, the way we live. We become more alive when Jesus is in our lives. He will expand our dreams and our plans. Well, today I'd like to tell you just how much God cares, based on my own personal experience with how much God cares. My story began years before I was born, but it was a story I didn't know until 1992. Now, growing up, I had a mother, I had a father, although I didn't really know him. He left by the time I was 4 years old, and I saw him once after that, 21 years later rather, before he passed away. I didn't know him. So I grew up with my mother, my brother Ron, who was 6 years older than myself, and I was content in our little family group. Well, unfortunately, as many of you know, my brother Ron was killed in a helicopter crash. He was 33 years old when he died, and I was devastated. So that left Mom and myself. Well, Mom battled cancer, and she passed away in 1993. Can hardly believe it's that many years ago now. But before she died, the year prior, she had told me something that I had no idea about. She was up visiting Edmonton, where I lived at that time, and we're driving along, and she said, do you want me to tell you something that's going to knock your socks off? Well, it was the strangest thing. God prepared me for that. All my life growing up, you'd hear about people who'd given up kids for adoption, and I thought, oh, my mother could never have done that. So it never dawned on me to ask her if she had done that, just assumed she couldn't have. Well, the moment she said, do you want me to tell you something that'll knock your socks off? That was an expression she didn't use. And I knew what she was about to say. I knew. Don't ask me how I knew, other than I believe God told me inside. I didn't know whether I had a brother, whether I had a sister, but I had a sense that that's what the story was about to be. And so she told me the story. Limited details. I learned that I had had a brother, born 8 years, almost 9, prior to my birth. He was born in Edmonton, Alberta. Now, just to carry on this story, I'll come back to this, but I was born at the coast. My parents had moved to Vancouver when I was, before I was born, when my brother Ron, he was born in Calgary, Alberta, and they moved to a Vancouver area, and I was born in New Westminster. And so Robert had been born in Edmonton, Ron in Calgary, me in New Westminster, BC. So now I just want to point that out as part of the story. So going backwards, going back to Robert's birth, well, he had a father who was Chinese. As a man who had worked together with my mother in a restaurant where they worked. I don't know any details, don't want to know those details, but she had a son with a Chinese father. Well, she was single, and at that time, there was a great deal of pressure put on women who were single to give up their children for adoption. Well, the fact also that he was a mixed race child probably exacerbated that. And so probably, and I don't know how much pressure was put on Mom, but I suspect there was. And so she gave him up for adoption. He was adopted by a Chinese family, and life went on. My mother later married, my brother was born, I came along much later. So now, Robert was born, his birth name was Robert Milton Jameson. He was adopted by a family whose last name was Ma, and his name was changed. He was given the name Joe Ma. So that's who grew up, Joe Ma. Well, they didn't treat him well. It's a very sad story, a very long story, and a very tragic story. They didn't educate him. At that time, there was, I guess, no follow-up from government or social services or things like that. So he wasn't educated. When he was, I believe it was about 7 years old, the family who had lived in Edmonton moved to Vancouver. They still didn't put him into school. So by the time he was 9 years old, they announced that they were moving to China. And he said, I don't want to go to China. But they said, oh, just for a little while, we're going to China. And so they moved to China. Well, that ended up being a major part of his life, and not a good part of his life. His stepmother and her mother just treated him like slave labor. By the time he was just 9 years old, he was out carrying those large pots of water in the fields and out working in the fields. I mean, he became slave labor. Well, life went on, not well for poor Robert, or poor Joe at that point in time. Life went on. He was in his, I think about 15 or 16, as I recall the story. And he had gone out for a walk. and he wore shoes. And when he came back, his step grandmother, I believe, said to him, "What are you doing wasting shoe leather? If you're going to go for a walk, you don't wear shoes." And she said, "And if you don't like it, you can leave." So he decided at that moment that the alternative of leaving may be better than the alternative of staying. And he walked out and had nowhere to go. So he was found that night sleeping on a park bench. Now, in those days in China, maybe today, I have no idea, but in those days, it was not permissible. You weren't allowed to just go sleep on a park bench. And he was taken into custody, and he was put into the juvenile detention system. And that meant a re-education program for him. Well, what it actually meant for him, he was put into labor, and he went to work in a rock mining factory. And he worked there for a long time. And once you're in this child labor education system, it's very difficult to get out. So many, many years went by. He worked on different jobs, hard jobs. Well, at one point in time, this is a great part of the tragedy, he was working at a sugar plantation factory, and somebody stole some stalks of sugar cane. He said he didn't do it, and I believe him. But somebody stole some stalks of sugar cane, and he was accused. Well, the penalty, you can't believe how severe the penalty was. He was put into prison, a hard labor prison, for 3 years for stealing some sugar cane that he hadn't stolen. And after the 3 years, he was moved to another prison. It was a detention camp, and there was no escaping. There were guards everywhere. It was a horrible situation. And he spent 3 years there. So 6 years he spent in prison for stealing sugarcane that he hadn't stolen. Well, when he got out, he was put back into the rock mining factory in different jobs. I don't know exactly offhand. He told me some of them. I have it documented in the book I've been writing, which isn't ready. But anyways, Robert had then met his wife Frances, and her family liked him. So even though he was a much lower economic status, they allowed them to get married. So they were married. Son Nelson was born in China. And shortly after Nelson's birth, Robert bumped into somebody who knew the family. Now, I didn't tell you, they had moved back to Edmonton many years earlier, just abandoning Robert in China. So his adopted family, they were long gone. They were back in Canada. Coincidentally, I did not know any of this story, but I met his stepfather once upon a time. I don't know what I would have ever said had I known the story, but I didn't know, and he has since passed away as well. But anyways, Robert bumped into somebody who knew this family, and this man said, "What are you doing here? I thought you were back in Canada." And Robert explained the situation, and the man said, "I am going back to Canada myself. I will make them bring you home." And he did. That was a very difficult process even at that, getting permissions, getting visas, because of course Robert had no proper identification. He had an old childhood passport, and that's all he had. But they did manage, after much difficulty, to bring him back to Canada. So he arrived in Canada in 1979, and after coming to Canada, it took 2 years for him to be able to bring Frances and Nelson to Canada. And after they were here, 2 daughters, Elaine and Emily, were born in Canada. Now, I'm telling you that story for a lot of reasons. To show you how much Jesus cares. Did Jesus care what Robert went through? Yes, he did. I absolutely believe that God cared greatly. But God is a gentleman. He doesn't intervene unless we ask him to. And so here this family, first of all, the decision of the state, the decision of my mother, the decision of the family that adopted him, all were bad decisions that placed this poor child into a terrible nightmare of a life. For the first 40 years of his life, it was a nightmare of a life. Happy to say it turned around later. Anyways, now, so here we have this child, and did God care about him? Well, I believe so. After I heard about Robert, I had no idea whether he was dead or alive. I didn't know if he was a doctor or an axe murderer. I didn't know if he was a nice guy or an awful guy. I had no idea what he had gone through or what he had become. All I could do was pray for him. And I prayed. I didn't know, like I say, if he was dead or alive, but I prayed for him. Well, the years went by, and when Mom told me about his birth, I only knew a few facts: where he was born, when he was born, what his birth name was. Didn't know anything more than that. For many years, I didn't do anything because I thought, well, nobody in the family even knows about it. I don't even know if my grandmother, Mom's mom, knew about Robert's birth. I don't know. But anyways, I didn't do anything for a number of years, but I thought about it. And at one point in time, I was encouraged to put something. I had found this adoption match website, and I put the information on there, the limited information I had, and it said it may take years or you may never get a reply. So the years went by. I couldn't have even told you what the website was anymore when on October 24th, 2007, I got a phone message left for me. Hello, I'm phoning about Robert Jameson. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know who she's talking about. I had no cousins named Robert Jameson. I had no uncles named Robert Jameson. It didn't dawn on me that she was talking about this brother whose name was Robert Milton Jameson. And that's how I always thought about him, as Robert Milton Jameson. So I thought, well, I'll phone her back. She was in Ontario. So I phoned back to say, well, I think you have a wrong number, but what's the story here? And I said, what is it you do? And she said, adoption match. And I thought to myself, you are talking about Robert Milton Jameson, aren't you? Yes, I am. You have a brother. Information was put on the website one day earlier that matched the information I had put on about 8 years earlier, and the match was made. So you have a brother. Where does your brother live? Richmond, British Columbia, a suburb of Vancouver. Where do I live? Richmond, British Columbia, that same suburb. Where in Richmond does he live? Blundell Road. Where do I live? Just off Blundell Road. Well, as it turned out, we live 2 kilometers or about 1.5 miles apart from each other. Now, keeping in mind that most of my life I did not live here, most of Robert's life he did not live here. He was born in Edmonton, I was born in Vancouver area. We never lived close to each other. He lived in China, I lived in Edmonton. He lived in Vancouver, I lived in Cranbrook. I mean, just to say that we didn't live anywhere close, but here we are. When we've met each other, we're down the street from each other. Did God care? I believe he did. I believe that perhaps when my mother died, maybe when she went to heaven and she found out what had happened to Robert, maybe she intervened with Jesus and said, can you please bring my 2 sons together? Our other son, he's here in heaven with us, but can you bring Jim and Robert together? And it was all orchestrated, I believe, by God. I don't think any of this was an accident. Yes, I think terrible decisions were made that put Robert's life at risk and in danger and gave him a terrible, terrible time. But I believe God intervened. And so we met that week. Took a few days before we were able to. Permissions had to be established and all that. Well, it turned out that Robert had just found out that very week his birth name. So Elaine, his daughter, thought, well, now that we know birth name, maybe we can find out something about the family. Not expecting to find a parent or a sibling or anything like that, but maybe we can find out, well, what nationality are we? And we know we're part Chinese, but we also know we're part something else. And they always wondered what that something else might be. So that week, Robert found out his birth name. His identity began to be established. And that week we met for the very first time. What a day that was. Even the people in the restaurant were practically in tears because they'd never had anything like that happen. Two brothers brought together who had never ever met each other in their whole lives. Yes, I believe God cared. I believe that God intervened that week. Another interesting factor about that, I mentioned that I had gotten the phone call about Robert on October 24th. That would have been my brother Ron's birthday. Now, of course, he had died many years earlier, but that, on his birthday, I got this message. Was it all a coincidence? I don't believe so. I don't believe there were any coincidences here. That week, I got a new family. I got a new brother and a sister-in-law. I got a great nephew and two great nieces. Sorry, take that back. I got a nephew and two nieces. The great nephew and great nieces, they came along a little bit later. It's a long story. It's an interesting story. I actually had the opportunity to perform the weddings of both Elaine and Emily. What a privilege that was to say, I have performed the wedding of my two nieces. My nephew had just gotten married before we met. Hadn't had a wedding reception yet, so I got in on the wedding reception, but not the wedding. So I have a great family now. My original family had all passed away, but God gave me a whole new family. What was totally surprising to me was I didn't expect a Chinese family as my family, but I love them, and I am so blessed to have them in my life. Yeah, it was just a surprise to discover all my family speak Chinese now, except me. I can't, except Gung Hei Fat Choi. Gung Hei Fat Choi, rather. Happy New Year. That's all I can say. Anyways, getting back to my question, does Jesus care? I can state by personal experience that the answer is yes. The Lord Jesus isn't out there somewhere taking a sachet through distant galaxies. He has his nose right here in our business, but he is a gentleman and he will not intervene or interfere if we don't want his involvement. He knows the most insignificant details about our lives, and he cares deeply what is going on. Why? Because there's a powerful emotion in the heart of God that we call compassion. We call it love. Make no mistake about it. Jesus gets all worked up on the inside. He's moved when he sees you in need. Body, soul, physical, emotional, spiritual, daily life, work life, church life, or eternal life. Whatever is going on with you, Jesus cares. So when the storms of life threaten to overcome you, when the power of fear starts to overtake the power of faith, keep in mind the power of God. When the power of hate begins to overwhelm the power of love, keep in mind the power of God. When the power of despair attacks the power of hope, keep in mind the power of God. When you wonder if it matters at all to stand up for justice against the powers of injustice, keep in mind the power of God. When people treat you like a nobody, keep in mind the God whose image you bear and whose strength gives you purpose. Keep in mind the power of God. Forget about impossibilities. There is hope because God truly does care. But we have to allow our lives to be open to God. Give him the freedom to change and forgive, to open up areas, to build your life the way he wants. He knows best. When he has the controls, when he's in the driver's seat, guess what happens? His plan, his vision become your plan and your dream and your vision. Romans 12, 1-2 says, so here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going about your daily life, and put it into God's hands and into God's will. And why should I care about doing God's will? Because he knows best. He cared about these two separated brothers. He cared about the third brother who never met. The other brother, Ron, never met Robert, obviously, at least not in this life. Robert since passed away. We had almost 10 years together before he passed away, but I still have a new family, and I love them very much. And I believe that God intervened to bring us all together as a family. I believe he moved heaven and earth to bring us together. So I believe in a God who loves each and every person, no matter our ethnicity, our economic status, even our religious background, a God who wants the very best for our lives, and a God who wants to use us to change our worlds. Yes, he wants to change us. He wants us to learn more about who God truly is. He wants us to develop our lives in a way that's going to benefit humanity and all mankind. He loves us. And on that note, I leave the thought with you. Jesus cares. He cared about me and my lost brother, and he cares about you. What's going on in your life that needs his intervention? He's there. Let him move. Turn the situation over to him, and God bless you richly. Thank you, and I hope we'll see you next Sunday at Renaissance Church in Vancouver. Bye for now.